Greetings. I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science, Issues and Innovations. Today, we learn about jellyfish and some other creatures. The creatures that we're talking about have a huge number of varieties, and they are in oceans all over the world. One giant variety called the lion's mane jellyfish has featured in the news recently in Massachusetts. And that caused us to reach out to a world expert on this kind of creature. Our guest is Laurence Madin. He's a marine biologist, senior science advisor, and retired deputy director and vice president for research at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts. Dr. Madin is featured, by the way, at the New England Aquarium with one of the species he's investigated. There are many of these floater organisms, and that is the subject for today. By the way, Dr. Madin is also involved in the development of marine robots that greatly facilitate the research on these organisms all over the world. And of course, their ecosystems too. We are very honored to welcome Dr. Laurence Madin. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And we understand you will be giving us a presentation, but I just want to mention to our viewers that you will just give us a brief discussion about this monster jellyfish that showed up off of Massachusetts. And I think that you're going to explain to us like where these things come from, their infinite variety apparently, and whether the changes in the oceans in terms of heating and acidification are making any difference as well to these creatures. And we really look forward to your discussion of the robots you've developed. Thank you, and it's all yours.
Well, thank you. Many of us saw news reports a few weeks ago about big jellyfish washing up on the beach in parts of Massachusetts and further north in Maine. So this is a picture of one of these lion's mane jellyfish that's washed up on a beach up in Maine, actually. And to give you an idea of the size, it can be up to a couple of feet or even 6 feet or so across. They're a little bigger when they're spread out on the sand. And in the water, they have so many tentacles and they're sort of fluffy looking that that's what gave them the name, the lion's mane. Usually this species, the big ones like this, are found further north in colder waters. It's not quite clear why we're seeing them down here now. But it is interesting that at about the same time, big specimens like this were reported off of the coast of Ireland and Wales in England, in the Irish Sea. So it's not just New England that is experiencing an influx of these large jellyfish. Now, the lion's mane is a fairly regular occurrence in our waters, but usually smaller ones. It's sort of a seasonal animal. It shows up in the summer. Sometimes the wind and the current will bring them close to shore, and then we notice them on the beaches. Other times that doesn't happen, and we're just not very aware that they're out there. But they have an annual life cycle that starts actually with very small attached forms that live on rocks and stones in the bottom of the ocean and they produce these little baby jellyfish usually in the fall, and those jellyfish grow through the fall and winter. And as the water's warm and as other life becomes more abundant, that they have things to eat, then they grow bigger. And jellyfish, like a lot of these jelly animals, can grow pretty fast because they're mostly water. The jelly-like tissue is, 95% water or better. And so it doesn't take too long for them, if they have a food supply, to get to a large size. So these are normal here, although we don't see them every year. And there are several other jellyfish that we do see. I should say that they do sting. And, but they're typically not a really serious or hardly ever a fatal sting. They're an unpleasant sting. And there's certainly a good idea to avoid them, especially if you see them in the water. And it's a good idea to keep a reasonably safe distance, like you see here, on the beach. The tentacles that have the stinging cells, they can still sting after they're washed up on the beach before they are completely dried out. And so it's good to look at them, but be respectful. Now, this is maybe the most conspicuous one that we have been seeing recently, but we do have other jellyfish. And I think that if we look ahead, we might be able to see a couple of other examples. Well, first of all, let me say that this is sort of three views of the lion's mane jellyfish. Over on the right is the stranded on the beach view that we saw before. And this is an example of one that has the more yellow-brown coloration. And in the middle is a live one in the water. And you can see that has a yellow color too, that's a little more reminiscent of what a lion's mane might look like. And then on the far left is a drawing that gives you a sense, and this is probably drawing made almost 100 years ago, of how many tentacles and how complex this mass of tentacles can be. And one of the things that was reported was that these are the biggest jellyfish in the sea, or some of the biggest creatures in the sea, and that they can be as long as a blue whale. Well, that's very misleading, because the body, which we call the bell, the round part, can be as much as maybe 5 or 6 feet in diameter, and a really, really big one. But what's really long are those tentacles that you see. And the tentacles can indeed stretch out to 20, 30, 40 feet sometimes in the water. And there's an old report of them being 100 feet long. And this is where the comparison to the blue whale comes in, that tentacle would be as long as a blue whale, but that's just a tentacle. It's not the entire animal. So it's important to understand that when you hear these things about how big it is, the animal itself is maybe 3, 4 feet, maybe 5 at the most in diameter. And most of them are much smaller. Most of them are the size of a dinner plate at best. So keep in mind that it's a big jellyfish. There are other jellyfish in the ocean that are as big or bigger, and we can see some of those. Let me show you a couple of other species that occur in our waters. These are two other pretty common jellyfish. On the left is one called Pelagia, and this usually is found further offshore, so it's not too common that it would come onto our beaches. But in other places in the world, it is very common, in the Mediterranean, for example. Now you notice there's a little fish swimming around with it. And this is a common behavior, that there are small fish that live around the jellyfish, and they actually sort of take shelter up inside them, because the jellyfish is something that most other fish don't want to get around or get near because of the stinging tentacles. So it's kind of a safe place for these little fish to hide. It's a little bit like the clownfish that live inside of sea anemones, Nemo, the little clownfish. So it's the same notion that you can take refuge hiding in a kind of a nasty stinging animal, and you yourself are protected from the stinging, probably because of coating on your skin that is partially protective. And then on the other side of the screen that's called the moon jelly, and the moon jelly is also quite common around here. Sometimes forms really, really big populations and swarms. We've seen them even in Boston Harbor sometimes, and Massachusetts Bay. It occurs all over the world. It's a very common jellyfish. It gets to be maybe about 6 or 8 inches, maybe 10 inches across. And it's a very flat kind of thing. It has tiny, tiny little tentacles, like a little fringe of tentacles. So it's something which doesn't sting very seriously. It's pretty harmless. And sometimes there are just so many of them that you can practically walk on them, it seems like. So these are two other kind of common species of jellyfish, not nearly as big as the lion's mane. So let me see if we can get to the next picture. And here we have some really big jellyfish that don't really occur anywhere near our beaches. But on the left, up on the top, is one called Nomura's jellyfish, and it's found in the Sea of Japan, between Japan and China mainly. And you can sort of see from the picture, there's a diver in the picture, and this jellyfish is about as big as the diver or maybe bigger. So they're easily 6 feet in diameter, 6 or 8 feet tall. They are a type of jellyfish that do not have the tentacles the way that the lion's mane does. You can see that there's some fuzzy stuff at the bottom there, but it's not the long stinging tentacles. And this is a different type of jellyfish which actually pumps the water in and filters the food particles out through that frilly part of its body. These are sometimes so big and so massive in the Sea of Japan and in that region between China and Japan that fishing ships, fishing boats with their nets, if they bring up a net full of these jellyfish, which obviously they don't want to do, but sometimes the jellyfish are so numerous, they can't help it. And on at least one occasion, a fishing boat was capsized because it tried to pull a net full of jellyfish on board, and it was so heavy it flipped the boat over. So they're a real bane of fishermen in Japan. Now, the other one in the bottom right corner is a deep sea jellyfish. It's called Stygiomedusa gigantea. Doesn't have a common name, but that's a really cool name for a huge, gigantic jellyfish that lives in the Stygian darkness of the deep sea. And it is also about 6 feet across at the bell. And then it has those long sort of curtain-like appendages hanging down. Also notice no tentacles. So it has a different means of catching food from the jellyfish that we're used to. And we know very little about it, but we think that somehow on those long fold, those sort of curtains of material that are hanging down from it, which could be 20 or 30 feet long, that somehow food is collected and digested there. So there's some pretty cool, big, really big, mysterious jellyfish in the ocean that we never see on our beach, which are probably just as well. But it's very exciting to find them and to know that there are creatures like that out there. Now, the other end of the extreme, we've got this guy. This is a jellyfish that's about the size of a quarter. And it's called Gonio nemus. And you can sort of see from the leaves there that this is a jellyfish that lives in very shallow water among eelgrass. And this has recently been discovered, actually rediscovered, in eelgrass beds that are in estuaries and shallow bays and so forth around Cape Cod and up into New England. And it occurs in other parts of the world as well, but it does live in this environment. It actually hangs on to the leaves of the eelgrass. And the reason that we care about this right now is that this actually is a really bad stinger. Not a fatal stinger, but a very painful stinger, probably pound for pound or ounce for ounce, stronger stinger than the lion's mane. And people have been, in the last few summers, in places like Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and so forth, some people have been stung by this when they're in shallow water. Now, there are some scientists at Woods Hole now who are working on studying this to determine whether this is a new introduction, a new species that's new for us, whether it's been here all along, and so forth. So we're learning a lot more about its biology. But I think it shows that jellyfish don't have to be big to be a problem. They just have to sting, and they have to be in places where people may encounter them. So something to watch out for if you're in shallow water and you're in eelgrass beds, that's where these things hang out. And again, they won't kill you, but they can be a painful sting. So that's kind of the local jellyfish story. But if we think about that, just for a minute about the history of jellyfish, I know, Yvonne, you mentioned at the beginning that there are many, many different kinds of jellyfish. And indeed, there are probably more than 1,000 known described species of jellyfish that have been collected and described and so forth around the world. And they also have a very long evolutionary history. So these are pictures of fossils, fossil jellyfish. And these are from the Cambrian period. So this is 600 million years ago. And it's that period of Earth's evolutionary history when multicellular animals first really sort of appeared on the scene. Now, actually, there are even older fossils of jellyfish-like organisms, things that look like they were jellyfish, and we can't obviously know for sure if they were exactly the same, but fossils that resemble that are even older, that go back even older than these. But these fossils are remarkable because they actually closely resemble some types of living jellyfish that we have here today. Doesn't mean that they're the same, that have been the same for that long, but the shapes and the forms of the bodies are very similar. So we think that the jellyfish body plan, you might say, is a very ancient one. And these are some of the earliest large animals that arose and evolved in the ocean. So besides jellyfish, there's a bunch of other kinds of jelly-like animals that people are not nearly so familiar with. But I just wanted to say a little bit about how we've gone about trying to study these. These are all things that live mostly out in the open water, so not necessarily very close to land. And they're always up in the water, so they're not either right at the surface or at the bottom. They're in that big amount of water we call the water column. And so one of the ways that we have been able to go out and look at them in their own environment is by scuba diving, and where you have a group of divers, the way you see in this picture, that can float around and find these animals as they are drifting or swimming by, and then put them in a jar and then bring them back to study them. Now, you see all these ropes, these little lines in the picture. That's actually so that the divers don't drift off and get lost, because otherwise, I mean, you're in the middle of the ocean, and without some way of keeping everybody connected together, it would not be a safe thing to do. But with these procedures and these precautions, it is very safe and very, very fascinating. It lets you, as that human diver, sort of be a jellyfish for a while and drift around amongst them and observe what their behavior is like and what they're eating and how they run away and what they look like and everything else. So it's been a great advantage and enabled us to learn a lot about many, many different kinds of jelly-like animals. Because there are many, many more jelly-like animals which are not actually jellyfish in the zoological sense. But they're very similar looking and they have many similar characteristics. And they turn out to be some of the most important and widespread and common animals in the ocean, but they're in parts of the ocean that most of us never see. They aren't coming to shore. They're not washing up on our beaches. So let's take a look at some of those. One of the things, just going back to the scuba divers for a moment, one of the things that's really critical, as I said, is that you're almost like you're one of the jellyfish, and you can see the things out in the water that you would never be able to see any other way. And these are just some examples of organisms that are living out there in the water. And part of the reason you would never see them any other way is that they are extremely fragile. They are large in many cases. They may be 10 or 20 feet long in some cases, like the one on the lower right. But they're very fragile. And to collect them, to bring them back, to catch them in some kind of a net and bring them back would break them up, would destroy them. You wouldn't see it. You wouldn't see the pattern, as you see on the upper left, of all that sort of veil of tentacles that are hanging down. That is an organism which is related to jellyfish, although not strictly speaking a jellyfish. You wouldn't see that fragile thing that's on the lower left, which is a type of comb jelly, which I'll talk about in a minute, or the one on the upper right, which is actually a colony of protozoans that make a colony which is as much as 2 or 3 feet long. But it's so fragile that it would all get destroyed. So these are very, very delicate things which only survive because they're out living in the water, suspended by the water. And to bring them on land or to bring them onto the deck of a boat or something, they would just fall apart. So you get a real insight into what animals that live in the ocean actually can look like and actually how they can actually behave. And this is interesting. Remember that the ocean out there is the biggest living space on the planet. Mm-hmm. bigger than anything else that we're familiar with. I mean, the ocean is 70% of the surface, and the ocean volume, all the water, is 95% of all the space for organisms to live in. So if you look at it from that perspective, these things, which seem exotic and weird and strange, are really the typical inhabitants of Earth. So some other examples, jellyfish, this is only a small selection of the 1,000 species. They come in all different sizes. Some are only a few millimeters long. And then we saw some of the examples of the really big ones that can be tens of meters long and can be, 2 or 6, 8 feet in diameter. Most of them are smaller than that, right? So most of them are maybe a few inches long. Some of them are relatively innocuous, relatively harmless. The one that's on the lower right here, the sort of kind of warty looking one that has only 4 tentacles, that is a particularly dangerous type of jellyfish called a cubomedusa. And we do have a few species in the Atlantic. It's more of a tropical thing. We don't typically see them up here where we are, although as our waters get warmer, it's possible. But there are species of these that live in Australia that kill people. And so these can be a very, very dangerous type of jellyfish. They have a very strong venom or toxin in their tentacles. And they have a number of other remarkable adaptations that enable to be very effective predators. Now, these things in this picture are not jellyfish, they're jelly-like, and we do see these in our waters. These are examples of comb jellies. Comb jellies, which are also called ctenophores, are completely different group of organisms from true jellyfish. But they're similar in appearance. Like jellyfish, they are also predators. I'm going to pause for a minute to take a drink of water. And they use, you can see the one on the right has a bunch of tentacles that it uses to catch its prey. The one on the left doesn't have tentacles for its catching of prey. It sort of opens itself up and it catches prey by getting them stuck to the inside of its body. So sometimes these are called sea walnuts or sea gooseberries. And in the summer here in the Northeast, the type that you see on the left, which is the one called sea walnut, is sometimes very common in the surf zone. And if you go out at night when it's dark, you see it glowing because these are luminescent. And in the surf zone where there's turbulence, it causes them to flash a sort of bright blue-green color. So there are examples of animals that have jelly-like bodies, and they're predatory animals just like the jellyfish, but they belong to a completely separate group of organisms zoologically. Also very ancient, by the way. They also go back to very near the beginning of the evolution of multicellular animals. And it turns out that these comb jellies that we're seeing are only a few, these are common examples we have here, but there are many, many, many more species that live out in the open ocean and the deep ocean, which we've only discovered in the last few decades. Now, this might be familiar to people. This is the Portuguese man-o-war, and it belongs to a group of animals called Sciphonophores. The Sciphonophores are cousins of jellyfish, you might say. In fact, they are sort of a subgroup of the major group that jellyfish belong to, but they have evolved in quite a different way. And they have evolved in a way that has a lifestyle of forming a complex colonial organism, an organism that's made up of many separate parts, each of which has particular functions. Now, we can see some of those in this example of the Portuguese man-o-war. First of all, the thing on the top, what's called the float, which in fact is exactly what it is. It floats on the surface. It also acts as a sail, so the wind can blow this thing through the water. But underneath it there are tentacles, just like a jellyfish has, that are stinging to sting the prey. And there are multiple mouths and stomachs, you might say, which when the prey is caught by the tentacles, it's brought up and it's engulfed by these multiple mouths and stomachs. And typically the prey for these animals are small fish. And so it takes many of these mouths and stomachs working together to digest a fish. They can have very long tentacles also that go down 10, 20 feet when they're extended. Mostly that's at night. In the daytime, usually they're up at the surface. So this is an example of how the animal is sort of put together out of different parts that have different functions. There are lots of other kinds of Sciphonophores. There are about 200 other species probably, but none of them float on the surface like this. They're all down in the water. So most people have never seen or heard of them, but they have a similar strategy where they have parts of the individual that are responsible for catching food, part for digesting it, part for providing locomotion and so forth. And these, again, are very common, live throughout the world's ocean, and mostly you never see them except for this one because it floats and it sometimes washes up on the beach. And as people probably know, this is also a pretty bad stinger. Again, very rarely a fatal stinger, but it is very painful and something to stay away from. So that's two examples of jelly-like animals, the jellyfish, the comb jellies, and the Sciphonophores that are all very similar in a way, and some of them are related, some are not. Jelly-like animals that have stinging cells, or in the case of the comb jellies, they don't sting, but they're what they call sticky cells, and they just stick to the prey without actually stinging, which means that for people, they're harmless. They can't harm you at all. If you're a tiny little copepod, a little crustacean, they're definitely bad news for you. Now, I'm going to move on here to a couple of other jelly-like animals, which are totally different from what we've been talking about, the jellyfish. And sometimes you'll see on the beach what's in the left-hand side of the picture. And these are, they're little clear bead-like things that wash up sometimes in the summer that typically have a little blue dot in them. And whenever this happens, we get a lot of calls saying, what the heck are these things? Are they dangerous? Can I touch them? And so forth. These are little animals called salps, S-A-L-P-S. And that's the only common name they have. And they are jelly-like, but they are not predators. They're actually filter feeders. That is to say, they feed on the phytoplankton, the algae cells, and whatever's in the water. And they do that by pumping the water through their body. And in the process, they filter the particles out. They have a little filtering mechanism inside their body, and that's what they eat. Now, the reason you see them, a bunch of them like this on the beach, is that they form chains. And if we see on the right-hand side, this is a different species which also occurs in our waters here, but usually offshore. So we don't typically see it on the beach. But you can see that it's a bunch of these animals that are all connected together. In this case, the red dot is their stomach, and the clear part is their sort of tubular body. And they swim by creating jet propulsion. They pump the water through the body in the front end and out the back end. That causes them to swim. And then that same current of water brings the phytoplankton particles in. They get filtered out inside and then go into their stomach. Now you might see at the top of, on the right-hand side, the second individual down, inside it, near the stomach, is another little tiny one. That's its baby. Now, these animals reproduce in two ways, a sexual reproduction and an asexual reproduction. The asexual reproduction is what creates this chain of connected animals. It's budded off from a larger individual, all connected together. You can imagine a string of paper dolls. They're all identical. They stretch out. They form a chain that's connected together. Then each one in the chain becomes the parent of a sexually reproducing parent that has a little baby inside. And you can see in the cast, there's a couple of these that have the little baby inside. The baby, this is going to sound familiar, is attached, it's called an embryo. It's attached to a placenta, and it's nourished by the mother's cells until it's old enough to be born. And once it's born, it will swim away. It'll swim out the back end. it will then grow up, and it will be the form that produces the chain to complete the cycle. So these animals are actually what we call chordates. So they are related to vertebrates. They are related to us much more than they are related to the jellyfish. They're much more complicated animals. They have a brain, they have an eye, they have a nervous system, they have a muscular system, they have a complicated digestive system, and so forth. Nevertheless, they are, still look pretty different from us and have a very different lifestyle. They are abundant in many parts of the ocean, almost never seen unless they wash up on the beach like the ones on the right-hand side. So if we look at a couple of other examples, these are different species. There are about 40 or 50 species of these salps. They range in size from about 1/4 of an inch long to almost a foot long. The one on the upper right is about a foot long. And you can see the one on the lower left, that's one of the forms that is producing the chain of babies. In this case, the chain is made up of a series of little wheels where the babies are all connected together in a wheel, and then the wheels are all connected together. And that forms sort of a colony, which will then eventually break free and drift off. And each one of those will have its own baby. So these are really kind of remarkable animals. One of the things that is interesting about them is that they help with global warming in a sense, because they feed on so much phytoplankton, and then they produce essentially poop, which sinks down out of the water, out of the surface water, and it takes a lot of the carbon that was in that phytoplankton out of the upper level of the ocean down into the deep sea, where it will probably stay for a long time. So they're part of what we call the biological pump that pumps material that's generated near the surface and sends it down into the deeper ocean. So they're helping. Let's see, we have a couple of other examples, I think. Actually, no, let's go down and take a look at what's beneath the surface layers. Now, Yvonne, at the beginning, you mentioned the development of robot technology. And this is an example of what's called a remotely operated vehicle. So this is a robot vehicle that's connected to a ship at the surface by you can see a cable at the top there. And this can be sent down into the deep ocean, and it's equipped with cameras and collecting jars and manipulators and so forth. So it can be kind of your eyes and your hands in the deep ocean, going where the divers can't go. And if you go down and start looking at what's down there, all of these kinds of animals that we've been talking about, the jellyfish, the Sciphonophores, some of the salps, a whole lot of other things that we haven't yet mentioned, are living down in the deep ocean, just in places where we didn't know they were there because we didn't have a way to look. And now with these vehicles like this, we do have a way to look. So when we do that, there's a whole bunch of really cool jellyfish that live down there. And these are just 4 examples. Some of these have tentacles. There's one on the lower left that doesn't have any tentacles. So we're seeing that to be a jellyfish and catch prey doesn't necessarily mean you have to have tentacles. It's not always clear just how they do it without tentacles, but maybe we'll figure that out. You get down into the deep water, sometimes these things are red. Notice that 2 of these are red, or at least partly red. That's because in deep water, there's no red light. The light fades as you go down deeper, and it gets bluer and bluer because the red light is filtered out. And then eventually there's no light at all. And then eventually you get to where the only light is coming from the luminescence of the animals themselves. And that's typically a blue-green light. So if you are red in color, you appear black and in the light that's available there, which means you're essentially invisible. So this is their camouflage pigmentation to make them invisible in the deep water where there's only a little bit of blue light. Now these jellyfish are maybe the size of your fist or a little bit bigger, but there are bigger ones down there. Here's another example of a big one. This is one called deep Starria, and it's about 3 feet across and 3 or 4 feet tall. It's kind of like a big empty bag. And inside, you can see there's some sort of tentacle-like structures that are hanging down. And above that are parts that we think are the mouth and the stomach. Now, very little is known about this organism. It's only been seen a few times, and occasionally pieces of it are caught and brought back. But we know that it is definitely a deep sea animal that we would love to know more about. And one of the things that you only can see when you go down there with some kind of a robot vehicle. Or a submarine. I mean, you can go down on a little submarine. And of course, we have a submarine here at Woods Hole called Alvin, which we've used for this work. But the robot vehicles are much more common now. I mean, there's a lot more of them than there are the submarines. So typically, that's what people are mostly going to be using. So, I mentioned the comb jellies that we see near the surface, the sea walnut and the sea gooseberry. And, but when we get down into deep water, that's when we get to where these comb jellies really go to town. That's where there's just extraordinary diversity of these animals down in places where it's relatively calm, relatively undisturbed. These are quite fragile, delicate, jelly-like organisms, and they wouldn't survive being in the surf zone. But down in the calm, deep water, they've got a wonderful place to live. And what we see in this sort of collage is just some examples of the species of these comb jellies that have been discovered in probably the last 30 or 40 years, since we and others in other places have started using the remote vehicles, the robots, and the submarines to go down and look for these things. So they're an important part of the ecosystem, an important part of the food web. They are predators, so they're catching some of the smaller animals that live down there. Of course, when you get down this deep, there's no light anymore. The light is gone by the time you get to 1,000 meters or 3,000 feet. And so there's no plant life. So the only food sources are other animals that are there, or material that is drifted down from the surface. And so these comb jellies, along with the other jellyfish and various kinds of Sciphonophores and squid and a lot of other things we haven't really talked about that live down there, rely on those other organisms, those other animals as their prey. A few of them can collect the particles and live on that, but mostly they're predators. Many of them are luminescent. And as you can see, many of them are quite strikingly colored. One of the things that we see in some of these comb jellies, and then the one that's over on the extreme left upper corner with the sort of rainbow colors, that is a phenomenon that's not a color due to a pigment, but it's a color due to a diffraction of light. So they have structures called comb rows that can actually break up the light and make it into rainbow colors. Now, of course, that wouldn't happen in the ocean because there isn't light shining on it. This was showing that because there's light shining on it when we took the picture. But the comb jellies that live near the surface, if you put them in a tank and had a light shining on them, you could see this same rainbow effect of diffraction of the light. It gives you those colors. So there's fascinating. These are kind of a little bit of a window into this world of the deep ocean. Reminds us that most of the planet is inhabited by things that we know almost nothing about. And these are even the things we can see. I mean, if we thought about the things we can't see, they're too small, it would be really mind-boggling. So let's say a couple of things maybe about some new technology for this. Yvonne, you mentioned at the beginning a new robot. And now I can't really take any credit for this. This is a product. I invented the name, but that's all. But other engineers here at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in our deep submergence lab designed and built this robot, which is called the Mizabot, because it's meant to operate in that part of the ocean that we call the mesopelagic, which is between about 600 feet or 200 meters and 3,000 feet or 1,000 meters. That's what we also call the twilight zone. And that's because there's a little bit of light there, that comes and goes with day and night, so that things that live in that have enough light to tell if it's day or night. And that actually has a big effect on their behavior, because many of them, when it's nighttime, will migrate up near the surface for where there's more food available. And then daytime, they'll go back down again so they can hide in the darkness, so the deeper water. So this twilight zone is a very important part of the ocean. Right now, here at Woods Hole, we have a whole program that's devoted to the study of the twilight zone and what's going on there, partly because we believe, or many people believe, that there may be a lot more fish there than we previously thought. So there is the potential for a new fishery to develop, but there's also the risk that if that is not properly managed, it could upset the ecosystem. And one of the other important functions of this twilight zone and the animals that live there is that biological pump that I mentioned earlier, where the movement of the animals up and down and their feeding activity and the eating and the pooping essentially creates a mechanism to move material from the shallow water down into the deep water. And that has a lot of implications, not only for the ecology of the ocean, but for the climate of the planet. Anyway, to work on study that environment, this new tool was invented and built, and now it's been in operation. And it's unlike the remote operated vehicle we saw earlier. This is completely disconnected from the surface. So it's a robot that's on its own. You give it some general instructions about what you want it to do, you put it over the side, it goes down, and it's going to be able to look around with its cameras and its sensors and find the animals. It's going to be able to track them, watch what they do, and so forth, and then eventually come back and bring back the data and the videos and the images and so forth. So it's a wonderful advance that our scientists here at Woods Hole are putting into practice now. So it's going to be another great way to learn what's going on in that big old ocean out there. So I'm going to stop sharing slides. I think we've come to the end of them.
Yes. Okay. That was really wonderful. There were several things in this, that the delicacy of a number of these creatures, that you can only really observe them in their environment. You can't be bringing these up. So the robots contribute enormously, I'm sure, to your studies. That alone is particularly interesting, but the diversity of these creatures and also what they contribute overall to the ocean general system, ecology, this is very much appreciated. We never get to hear about it. And I really think this was wonderful. Thank you ever so much for sharing this with us. And it's just invaluable. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. Happy to share some of this.